I work at my name is Ross Kaffenberger. I'm actually going to be speaking again right after this. I work at a company called LearnZillion. We're trying to hire a software engineer to join our team. We are in education. We build curriculum for K through 12. So if you want to do something to help the children of our nation and improve classroom instruction for teachers, we're a remote company. So if you're interested in that, check us out. LearnZillion.com/careers. Thank you.
And Ross, I might have missed it, but who are you looking for? Sort of what level experience?
We're trying to hire for a senior software engineer position.
Okay.
We use Rails and Webpack.
I'm glad you use Webpack, otherwise this whole leaving would have been dubious. Okay, anyone else? Okay, I have one. I'm Dmitry Nesterenko. I work at Exo Group. This is the space where you're in right now. We're hiring a few folks on the senior end, probably with a Node.js Mongo experience, although we're never truly set in stone. Usually a senior person is, I'm learning this, I'm learning that. And so, you know, in between. Here we use Ruby, Node, Swift, Java for Android, probably a few other things I'm forgetting to mention. And I'm also working with another company, Stay Wonderful. They are not doing perhaps as inspiring things as Ross's company, but they're basically trying to offer people better deals when they book hotels. So they're like a hotel and plus a deal type of a venue, and looking for Python experience. So you can talk to me about any of those two things. All right, anyone else? Jobs? Once, twice, 3 times? Okay, cool. Thank you so much. I remembered to hit record, so we did that. And next up, Michael's going to announce our speaker, and then we're gonna give it a whirl.
All right, how's everybody doing?
Yeah.
There we go. Okay. We got a few claps here and here. Is anybody here for the first time? Raise your hand. Oh, nice. So actually what we were going to do is we're going to get all you guys in a line right here. You're going to tell us your life story. If you can. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, so next up we have a guy who is as wise as he is tall. And Ross Kaffenberger is going to tell us about Webpack with Rails. So give him a hand.
I want you to imagine you're at your next stand-up meeting or sit-down meeting, and you're discussing with your teammates how to improve your application, how to deal with the performance challenges that you have, maybe an architectural change you think is really pressing, and folks are sharing ideas, and then someone on your team says, I think we should switch to Webpack. I've seen a few tutorials. It looks like it should be pretty easy. Now I want you to imagine your response. So this talk is called Look Before You Import, a Webpack survival guide for Rails developers. My name is Ross Kaffenberger. You can find me at Rosta on just about everywhere, like GitHub and Twitter and whatnot. If you have questions and whatnot after the talk, if you don't get a chance to ask me, feel free to reach out on Twitter. I am giving this talk at RailsConf next week. Who's going to RailsConf? I know some of us are. So you don't have to come to my talk if you don't want to there. But I would appreciate some feedback, since I'd love to make this great for you all, but even better at RailsConf. I do have the maybe unfortunate challenge of speaking right before Tender Love, so I know that there's going to be a little extra pressure. I do think, though, that when I look at this picture, it inspires me. It reminds me that the original title for this talk was going to be How to Webpack Without Losing Your Hair. That's before I remembered that this is what I look like to most people. I sometimes forget that my picture of myself when I program is something more like this. So I'm going to try to work on that. As I said, my name's Ross, and I love Ruby. My parents could not have imagined that my name would become virtually synonymous with Ruby open source software. I think that it was sort of preordained that I would become a Ruby developer, and my parents had no idea, but I'm very grateful for that foresight. There is a conference next month that's named after me. In Amsterdam, there's a Ruby conference called ROSConf, and I'm very honored that they chose to name their conference after me. And if you happen to be in Amsterdam next month, I won't be there, but let me know how that goes. Cool. So as I mentioned before, I work at a company called LearnZillion, and if you're interested, check us out. So we actually moved all of our JavaScript over to Webpack recently, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. I just want to mention that I'm also a dad and a father to a 4-year-old terrier. If I could sum up, sometimes my colleagues ask me, what's it like to be a dad? I mean, there's some folks who are younger. What's it like to have a dog? Is it a lot of work? And basically, I can sum up my feelings about being a father or being a dog father in one word, is that every day they bring me a ton of joy. And if you all decide to become parents yourselves, if you're not parents yet, or if you decide that you might want a dog one day, my only hope for you is that your days are filled with lots of joy as well. Okay, so speaking of joy, we're here to talk about Webpack. So as I mentioned before, our company, LearnZillion, we are a Rails stack, a Rails monolith, and we're about 5-6 years old. So we have a lot of legacy JavaScript that we have been deploying on the Rails asset pipeline. You can imagine 5-6 years ago, there really weren't that many JavaScript frameworks that are as popular as there are now. So we have a lot of jQuery spaghetti that gradually turned into something else, that gradually turned into something else over time. And a lot of that legacy code we're still dealing with. But more and more of our application had been moving to the front end. And we had grown to a point where we had almost 300 some JavaScript source files. And every time we wanted to make a change, it would take 10 to 15 seconds to reload because Sprockets was pre-compiling. So we decided to change over to Webpack about this time last year. And I was lucky enough, or maybe unlucky enough, to have been tapped on the shoulder to lead this project. So we had this vague notion that Webpack was better, but I can't say that we were Webpack experts at all. We knew pretty much very little about it other than it seems pretty great. How many of you all have heard of Webpack before? Great. How many of you all have used it in production? Okay, a handful. So my sense is that for many Rails developers, Webpack's a fairly new concept. And that's part of what I want to get at today. And some of the challenges we might face coming from the Rails asset pipeline, things that we faced in making this change over. We had this vague sense that Webpack has better dev tools, it's better at dependency management, it has this huge ecosystem. I mean, JavaScript is exploding, so there's a lot of tooling out there that's really sort of taking off compared to what sort of the Rails stack offers. We were excited about ES6, and also Webpack does this thing called dynamic code splitting, which we'll get into a little more. All these features seemed really great to us on the surface. We didn't know how it all worked, but yeah, it's cool. Let's try to make our development experience better was sort of the first challenge we wanted to face. But what we did learn is that coming over to Sprockets, or coming over to Webpack from Sprockets was a little bit like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. We were coming at Webpack with our Sprockets mindset, and I want to do my best to convey how you might change that perspective if you all decide to make this kind of change yourself in an application. So we're going to cover 3 scenarios that you might deal with if switching over to Webpack from the Rails asset pipeline, which will uncover 6 potential problems and 7 survival tips that I will offer to you as my opinionated perspective on how to deal with these issues. But first, let's make sure that we're all on the same page. Just so we know what Sprockets and Webpack are, they both aim to do the same basic thing. Take a lot of JavaScript files or a lot of CSS files and bundle them into one or few files that the browser can understand. Okay? So taking what we like to use in development and making it readable by the browser. Okay, and they have some similar features. So both Sprockets and Webpack do pre-processing. By that I mean, if you like CoffeeScript, great. If you like ES6, great. If you like TypeScript, you can write your JavaScript in those formats, and you can pre-process it so that in Sprockets or Webpack, potentially you could have those files transformed into JavaScript that most browsers can understand. Same for things like SAS to convert to CSS. But it's really important to understand that the way that they do this, when I say the way that Sprockets and Webpack convert JavaScript to a format that the browser can understand, is very fundamentally different. The Sprockets will take all your JavaScript files that you require and stitch them together in the order that you ask in a form, basically that's like saying, add all these files into one. It's file concatenation. All the JavaScript files by default will be in the same global scope. But Webpack turns each one of your files into a separate module that has its own JavaScript scope that is separate from all the other modules in the system. And if you don't understand that principle, I can point to some tutorials later on, but it's a really key thing to understand as you start moving code over to Webpack. Both Sprockets and Webpack offer some development tools. In Sprockets, you get a middleware in development. That means you have to spin up the whole Rails process just to pre-process your JavaScript or CSS files. And that can come with some overhead if you have a large amount of files to process. In Webpack, you run a separate server in development. So alongside your Rails server, you have to also manage a separate Webpack dev server. So there's more to do, but there's some advantages in that you don't need to have that Rails process tied up while there are changes being done on the Webpack side. And then both Sprockets and Webpack do pre-compilation for production. So there's no server that you have to run for Rails. There's no server that you have to run for Webpack to get these static assets to be usable in production. You would run some kind of build step before you deploy your application. I will say, though, the Webpack comes with a lot more features than Sprockets beyond what we've described, some of which we'll touch on today. If you need some background on Webpack, these 3 tutorials are probably the very best that I found to help me understand Webpack better. The Survive.js Webpack book, the Webpack Learning Academy, and Webpack from Nothing, all from fairly well-known members of the community. By the way, I'll post these slides later, so you don't have to take notes, but definitely these resources were the best that I found to help me get a feel for Webpack. None of them are specific to Rails per se, but we'll touch more on the Rails side today. And that said, I'm not really going to do a Webpack tutorial. I think that's something you can do on your own. I think you get the basic concept of what Webpack's trying to do, but we will cover some of the challenges. Now, Webpack, I want to acknowledge that it's a really challenging piece of software to understand. And if you start feeling like you hate Webpack when you start using it, you are not alone. Some people passionately hate Webpack. Now, it can be extremely hard to configure, it's extremely hard to understand, and I would not take that as a reflection on yourself, like I might have, and felt really bad about how hard it was to get Webpack to work. Or maybe I was just trying 100 things and accidentally got it to work, and good, I understand Webpack now. That tends to be the initial feeling. Some folks feel that it's over-engineered, and I can't argue with the fact that it's a fairly complex piece of software. There's actually a website devoted to WTF moments for Webpack, and if you decide to take on this challenge yourself, I encourage you to contribute there once you find your own thing to complain about. So I've had a few of these moments myself where I felt like throwing my computer out the window, and I want to do my best to save you all from these moments, although that can be part of the learning experience as well. So one project that helped tip our decision-making to go with Webpack was the fact that Rails, around this time last year, announced support for Webpack through the Webpacker gem. Well, it might be kind of hard to figure out, well, what does Webpacker do? Well, I will say you don't need Webpacker to integrate Webpack with Rails, but it makes it a whole lot easier because Webpack makes no assumptions about what you want for your project. And that adds perhaps a layer of a learning curve that makes it harder to get up and running. So Webpacker basically takes the Rails approach and says, I want to make a bunch of decisions for you all and set up some configuration for you to make it easier to set up Webpack and start running with it. So with Webpacker, you can have Webpack integrated into your system within a few minutes. Now, how you get your existing JavaScript over to Webpack is part of the challenge we'll be talking about. And Webpacker will only get you so far as part of the sort of theme of today. So we're going to talk through a few different survival scenarios. First being organizing code. The second would be taming dependencies that you might bring into your application. And the last would be dealing with predictable caching. So let's jump in to the first one. Now, I will be showing some code here. I wouldn't get too wrapped up in the details. If you do have questions, we can take them at the end. Webpack does tend to move pretty fast. So a lot of the configuration I might show you today might not be relevant in a year from now, but I think the concepts will still be relevant. So let's focus on that. So one of the issues we ran into right away was understanding directory structure in a Webpack project. Now, I've been following the Webpacker issues for about a year now, and there are quite a few of them, and most of them are not actually bugs with Webpacker, but they often map to a lack of understanding of how to use it. And one of the biggest and most common issues I've seen are huge build times. Why is it taking 30 minutes to build Webpack? That seems kind of ridiculous. Well, it usually boils down to one key problem. And I think it's all rooted in how we think about sprockets first. So let's talk about how you organize your JavaScript there. Usually you put all of your JavaScript in the app assets JavaScripts folder. That's usually the default. And you can imagine that if you want to pre-compile certain bundles in sprockets, you would have to add to the pre-compile configuration to get different bundles to display. Maybe you want your application.js to be served in one context, your admin.js only for admins. That's fine. You can set that up with some configuration. Typically, we mix all these files together, and you have to tell Rails which ones you want to serve as the bundles that will show up in the public directory. In this case, application and admin.js will be bundled to the public directory when we pre-compile these files on the Sprocket side. All right, but things work a little differently in the Webpacker setup with Webpack. So you would take your JavaScript and eventually try to move it all down to a different directory called app/JavaScript. Now there's also a special directory within JavaScript, in app JavaScript called packs. Now that's where you'd want to put all those files that you want to be the entry points, the pre-compiled files that you would have. In fact, in Webpack parlance, these are called entry points because they are the start of a dependency graph. Now, this would essentially get you the same thing we just saw on the Sprocket side by putting these files in the packs directory, the admin and application.js files. Those are the ones that serve as the entry points. Those would get pre-compiled into the output directory, which by default with Webpacker is public packs. There's no additional configuration you need. Any file that goes into the packs directory becomes pre-compiled. And you might see where this is going. The most common mistake people make is to put all of their JavaScript into that packs directory because they see that that's what you need to do to get things running. So they start putting every other submodule that would be included in that application or admin.js pack also in that file, which means that they will also now be entry points into separate bundles. And that will make your build take a long time. Well, how can you know that you've made this mistake? Pay attention to the build output. So Webpacker gives you an executable, very easy to run. Bin Webpack will run your Webpack build. It's like running rake asset precompile for sprockets. And if you see a bunch of files emitted that don't belong, these are files, so what this build log is saying is every single one of these files that's emitted is ending up as a precompiled file into your public packs directory. When we only wanted application and admin.js, we're actually precompiling every single component or module that we had included if we accidentally set up our directory structure that way. Also, Webpacker by default will compile source maps as well, which is why most of these are doubled in that output. So really, there's just a quick fix. Make sure you keep the pack separate from the rest of your source code. It really doesn't matter where you put it, as long as you don't put those submodules into this packs folder. And then you should really just see only a few files output, depending on how many things that you expect to be precompiled. So my survival tip number one is really pay attention to the log output. It can tell you a lot about what's happening inside your Webpack build. And also keep in mind, just because something is a convention in Sprockets doesn't mean that it will work the same way in Webpacker. That's a fairly simple example, the directory structure, but it comes up time and time again. And I think a lot of us came into Webpack thinking, oh, we have Webpacker, it should just work just like the Rails asset pipeline. But turns out time and time again, that's not the case. So this is just a reminder that conventions don't always line up. All right, so next issue. You might be coming to Sprockets, or you might be coming to Webpack from Sprockets and thinking, well, how do I do require tree? I like being able to say in my application.js file, require tree, and it takes every file in some directory and will concatenate it and add it to the build. That makes it really easy. So what you might want to do is say, import some directory when you take that ES6 converted file on the Webpack side. Well, this won't work by default. If you import a directory, Webpack won't know what to do with it, but you can make this work with a little extra insight. So here's a Webpack specific API called require context. And this is actually a function that you can give some arguments to, like it works a little bit like directory glob. And it will say within a given directory, so if you had an index file in some directory, this particular line would take every file inside of the some directory that matches a JavaScript extension. And with this snippet of code after that, it would basically be like iterating over those files and requiring them one by one. Okay, so you can get require tree with a little extra work. You don't get anything out of the box. Webpack just assumes you know how to use this function and you can make it work for you. Well, what if you want to actually get a module out of that directory? What I just showed you wouldn't work for that. You would have to add a little more code to make that work. You would have to do something where you use that require context call, but you would have to, in that index file, build up a list of modules and then give them each some module name that you can then export from that index file. Don't have to pay too much attention to this code, just to get a feel for the fact that in Webpack, you get a lot more control over how you can add these files into your build. But if you look at that code, it didn't seem very friendly, right? It's a little bit hard to grok. There's basically you pay the price of control over friendliness when you come to Webpack, and that's also a theme that comes up time and time again. All right, so we've talked a little bit about organizing code, and now we're going to get into taming dependencies. So as I mentioned before, we had a fairly mature JavaScript project with a lot of code in our Ruby templates, a lot of global variables like jQuery that we just used everywhere, because that's sort of typical of early Rails projects. And we had a lot of jQuery plugins, some of which that haven't been updated in 4 or 5 years. Now, I'm sitting here thinking, how do I get this into Webpack? Do I rebuild all these features or try to make them work? Well, I tried to make them work, so let's see how that happened. It didn't go so well. So here would be what our project looked like in Sprockets, a very simplified version. So we actually had a vendor bundle where we put jQuery and Lodash and some of the big JavaScript framework code that we used that didn't change very much, so that it could be nicely cached. And anything we changed a lot would go into the application.js bundle. And both of these files would be included in the application layout. So this is a form of manual code splitting. We would, by hand, decide what would go into which bundle. And in the vendor bundle, we might have our jQuery Rails asset gem. And in the application bundle, we might pull in some of our own application code. And I'm just showing you a couple plugins that we used that will illustrate the problems that we ran into when we tried this. One key point here is that in order to make this all work and not break our code base, I had to make the jQuery inclusion relevant to the global scope. So I had a bunch of code that was in Ruby templates. And because, like I mentioned before, Webpack puts everything into modular scope, there was nothing that would be available into the global scope unless I did something explicitly to make that happen. I'll show you how I did that later. But for this purpose, I added jQuery to the global scope. This is what it would have looked like in Webpack, pretty much the same thing with import statements replacing those require statements we used in Sprockets. Well, turns out there was a bug when I did this. So let's walk through the bug step by step. First, I moved jQuery over to the vendor bundle. And then in the application bundle, I added chosen.js. You can imagine I'm moving a lot of other files too. It just so happens I'm going to focus on just these. And of course, I wanted to test that chosen plugin worked. It's like a fancy select menu. And I could see that it worked by testing it. I could also see on DevTools, if I called $.fn chosen, it would return a function. And then I added this slick carousel, which is also a jQuery plugin that does the nice image type of carousel interaction. And I could test that that worked. On DevTools, if I call $.fn.slick, that would return a function. But something happened. When I retested chosen, it came back undefined. It stopped working. And I basically said, what? I wasn't quite sure how adding one jQuery plugin could break another. So I decided I needed to get a better sense of what was happening inside the build. So this is a very good tool to use if you want to visualize what's going on inside your Webpack bundles. Here's just a little boring configuration code. In config Webpack development.js, that's a Webpacker specific file that you might use JavaScript to modify the Webpacker environment and add this plugin in. And what it gives you is a zoomable tree map to allow you to see the relative sizes and locations of every single module that you've included inside your bundle. So it's a very valuable tool to see what just happened when I added this dependency to Webpack. So this is what the picture of our Webpack bundle looked like when we added jQuery and those jQuery plugins. Can anyone see the problem that might have happened when we added both of those bundles together? So we're including both of them on the same page. Remember, vendor has included jQuery explicitly, and we've included a few jQuery plugins explicitly in application.js. Well, you can see that jQuery has been included in the vendor bundle. jQuery has also been included in the application bundle. I don't know about you, but I don't want two instances of jQuery running on my page at the same time. To get a better sense of what actually happened to that jQuery instance, it might be helpful to look inside the source code. So I opened up the chosen.js file I was including. Chosen.js is a really old plugin that hasn't been maintained in a few years. It's actually written in CopyScript and then compiled down to this format when we include it in our build. And it basically assumes that jQuery is available in the global scope. This line right here is accessing jQuery at the global scope. So when we had added jQuery in the global scope, chosen worked just fine. Now, Slick Carousel is a more up-to-date plugin. And it uses a snippet of code that some of you may have seen before. It's called the universal module definition. And what it basically does is it says, I want to take all of my library code, but wrap it inside a closure that basically says, I'm going to test for the presence of these popular JavaScript module loaders like AMD or CommonJS before I check for jQuery in the global scope. And guess what? Webpack recognizes these statements. And when it sees something like require jQuery, it says, okay, I'm going to add jQuery to the build. So then when we added Slick Carousel, jQuery is added as a dependency. We didn't know this until we looked inside the source code and analyzed the bundle. Now that would be a reason why this happened, or why we saw that bug. When we added jQuery, remember it's adding $ to the global scope, because that was something we did to configure it that way. We added chosen.js, it worked just fine because it looks for jQuery in the global scope. But when we added Slick Carousel, it added a new instance of jQuery. And because only $1 variable can exist on the global scope, it clobbered the one that we had before and any plugins that we added to it prior to that. So the main takeaway here, all of that was built up to say, if you're going to code split, which I highly recommend you do, generally, if you have a large application, you need to let Webpack do the work. Now, what might that look like? So this is a Webpacker 3 solution to making Webpack do code splitting for us. Now, Webpack just announced version 4, and this configuration is completely different, unfortunately. But this is what we're using currently, and the same principle would apply when we upgrade. But this is basically saying, take every module that's common to both of your bundles and put it in just one of them, in the vendor bundle. So that means when we added that configuration and then reran our build, notice inside vendor, we have jQuery, because we said take any common module that's used in both and add it there. You can notice in the application bundle, jQuery is no longer there. So that got our plugins working. We were very happy. Main takeaway of all this is know your dependencies. You may need to understand what your dependencies are now bringing into your application, or whether or not they rely on global variables, because that becomes a very important distinction when you're using Webpack. Where you can do something to fix these modules. If you have some legacy code, there's something called module shimming. You can actually use Webpack to change the behavior of the modules that you're bringing in. So I mentioned before that we added jQuery to the global scope. That's not something that Webpack typically recommends. It wants you to keep everything inside the module scope. But we needed to sort of have this legacy behavior. So we added this thing called expose loader. Now loaders are a little confusing, but think of them as preprocessors like we have in Sprockets. So this basically says, every time you, in the expose loader basically says, I want to expose a particular variable to the global scope. And using the Webpacker configuration, you can just add some snippets to say, anytime I include jQuery, expose the $ variable to the global scope. But you might not want to do that. Instead, we could have done something with this, with chosen.js. So remember, we have this global variable here. Instead of making global variables available to all, what I might want to do is fix the global variables that I have and make them use something else. And you can do that with loaders as well. There's something called the imports loader. So this would be going the opposite direction. What I'm basically saying is here is take any global variable that I specify. So for chosen.js, I might actually want to change the value of a global variable like jQuery or $, and instead make it import dependency instead. That way, I can make chosen.js not rely on global variables. Now, don't pay too much attention to the code. Of course, it tends to change, but you get the concept. You can use a lot of powerful plugins with Webpack to change behavior. And in this case, we're injecting dependencies rather than just relying on them to figure them out themselves. So just a quick review, loaders are used for pre-processing like they would be in Sprocket. So typically you would use Webpack loaders to change a file format from one form to another, but you can use it to do very micro changes in different modules. Webpacker will set up most of the loaders that you need for your projects, but you can introduce side effects like the ones we just saw. Survival tip number 5, these legacy dependencies, either fix them or get rid of them. You can see that we jumped through a lot of hoops to fix them. I would recommend trying to get rid of them instead without dealing with all that configuration. You basically have to say, do I want to deal with Webpack or do I want to deal with my application? And that's going to be a choice you'll need to make if you have any legacy code. All right, last survival scenario is predictable caching. Now, I encountered another problem when I was moving these files over to JavaScript that I like to call the case of the misbehaving fingerprints. And I want to illustrate it with a simple example. Imagine our application.js just has this code. We import some function, we call that function, and when we run the Webpack build, we still have our code splitting that gives us a vendor bundle and an application bundle. And by default, Webpacker will set up fingerprinting for you. Fingerprinting, what I mean by that is that it will take the contents of the bundle and create a digest that reduces it down to basically a string of characters that will allow you to cache that, if you change the contents of that bundle, then that fingerprint will change to bust any caching that's been done in the system. So let's just say we added one dependency at this point. We added some module and we did something with it, not too exciting. And inside that module, just so now that we've learned we have to pay attention to our dependencies, there's nothing going on in here that's bringing in any new dependencies. This is just to show that all I've done is changed the application bundle. So what might you expect would happen to the fingerprints? Right, so they would update, and they do if you look at the application.js. So remember, that's the only one that I changed. The first fingerprint is 6AB something, and the second fingerprint is 3F2 something. So we expected those to change, but something that made me very sad happened. If you look closely at the vendor fingerprints, the ones that I did not change, they did in fact update the fingerprints. Now, this pretty much defeats the purpose, in my book, of using a separate vendor bundle, is if every time I change application bundle, my vendor bundle changes also. Why split them out if this is going to happen? So this made me very sad. All right, to understand why this is happening, I had to understand how Webpack works. And to illustrate that, we're gonna do a little brief cartoon interlude. So imagine this red box is the entry point to one of your bundles. It's a JavaScript file that pulls in other dependencies. Well, Webpack, what it will do is walk the tree in breadth first search to find all the dependencies of that entry point. And then it will find all the dependencies of those dependencies and build out a tree of all those dependencies to pull them into your bundle. And what it will do is link all those import statements as function calls so that the modules that import other dependencies will have access to those values that have been exported. And Webpack will turn those into function calls that your browser can understand. And all these modules be bundled into, let's call it typical bundle. And in order to stitch all this behavior together, Webpack actually adds some code to your bundle. Sprockets does not do this. Sprockets concatenates. Webpack actually adds something that I call the runtime. It's about a 50-line piece of code. If you look at it unminified, you could read it in just a few minutes. It actually does the work to keep these modules communicating with each other and to ensure that when you ask for a module, you're getting the right one. Part of what that runtime does is keep a list of all the modules represented as IDs. You could think of it like IDs in or indexes into an array. In fact, the entire module set is passed as an array argument into the runtime as a function if you look at the code. And then quite literally, the first entry point gets the ID 0 by default, and then the other dependencies thereafter get numerical IDs. So this is actually closer to what we had. We had two separate bundles, if you recall, vendor and application. And because we were pulling common modules into vendor, that includes that runtime. So it was ending up in the vendor bundle. All right, and in order for the runtime to be able to access modules in both the vendor and application bundle, it needed to know up front all those IDs of all those modules, including the ones in vendor and the ones in application. Well, you can imagine, we illustrate what we did earlier. We added a dependency, we added a module to application.js, and it needed an ID. It might have caused some of the other modules, their IDs, to change. Well, guess what needs to change when we update those IDs? The runtime. This little piece of code has a list of all those IDs. And now what we've done when we've changed the IDs in application.js is that we've changed the runtime. If you change the runtime, it's part of the vendor bundle. That changed too. Well, what's the fix? Well, more configuration is how we dealt with this. So if you recall, this is what we did to share common modules in the first problem we solved. Turns out we have to add another instance of this common module plugin that extracts that runtime into its own bundle. So we needed a third bundle to keep the runtime out of the vendor bundle. And this is how you would configure it in Webpack 3. And don't pay too much attention to it if you're going to use Webpack 4, because that's going to completely change. But the concept is still there. You need to understand that that runtime keeps track of all your modules if you're going to do any code splitting. One more thing we did is we had to add a plugin to make sure those IDs didn't change all the time. And there was a bunch of plugins that do that. I won't go too much into this. You might be looking at all this and be saying to yourself, dear God, why would I ever want to do this? And I think that's kind of the point. You have to be prepared to face some of these challenges when you come to Webpack. This is sort of a picture now of what we have. We have 3 bundles. If we change application.js, we accept that runtime.js will change. It's a very small snippet of code. But now our vendor.js is protected from this caching problem because we've separated the runtime out. All right, so that we didn't know this coming in. We didn't know what we were getting into when we started to do this code splitting. And it was a little bit shocking to us that we needed to do this much configuration and this much work just to get what you have for free in Sprockets. This fingerprinting behavior we sort of take for granted and we never think about. Well, guess what? You have to think about it in Webpack. Survival tip here is to understand this runtime and how it behaves and what I just illustrated. So you might be ready to give up. I want to leave on a high note. So we have one more common issue that you might want to tackle in Webpack that I think is the reason why Webpack was created. It's called asynchronous bundles. Now, imagine you have a dependency. In our case, we actually use the library PDF.js to render PDFs in Canvas elements for teachers to be able to upload documents and things like that. PDF.js, it's a huge library. It's like several megabytes. And that's a huge amount of JavaScript to be passing down in, say, your application or your vendor bundle and blocking page load. So if you imagine if you had code like this, if you have this normal import statement, it would pull it into a regular bundle like the ones that we have. Well, there's one small change, this one little trick that you can make to take that dependency out of your main bundles and make it asynchronous. So here we move the import statement in line as a function call. So import actually also is a function that you can give a path to an existing module or dependency. And what this says is I want to take this PDF.js dependency and not bundle it in with application.js, but to pull it out as its own separate bundle. And Webpack will do the work to get that bundle for you when this code is evaluated at runtime, but not during the initial page load. It actually returns a promise. When that promise resolves, you will then have access to the module, and so you could then do the processing with that once that resolves. So there is sort of a lag. If there's potentially a button click, you might need to account for that with like a spinner or something. This all is done on your behalf. There's no configuration needed to make this work. This dynamic import, just recall, this is something that you can load on demand. It's really the sweet spot of Webpack. And I would say one more thing, if you want, again, caching to work, you actually have to tell Webpack, I want to name this module. Remember, modules get IDs, like numbers. You have to actually do this magic comment. If you were missing magic comments from Sprockets, yeah, you get them in Webpack too. This is saying, take this Webpack module, which are often called chunks in Webpack, just for naming, a little difference there. And this will make sure that you get a chunk or a module called PDF something something in the actual build. This is better for debugging, also better for caching. You don't want that bundle to change its ID every time you deploy. Okay, so my final survival tip for you is if you're going to use Webpack, take advantage of the features that it gives you that Sprockets does not, including these asynchronous bundle behavior. So I would say if you're, like, this might be the most controversial tip that I have. If you're going to use Webpack, but you're not going to use asynchronous bundles, I might ask, why use Webpack? I'm not going to try to convince you to switch to Webpack. I think that it serves a very important use case, but it's not for all Rails developers. I think one point that I've tried to make over and over again is that the expectations you might have coming from the Rails asset pipeline might let you down unless you come to Webpack with a different mindset. It's a completely different beast. It does things differently than Sprockets, and it prioritizes different things, like asynchronous bundle loading over easy, predictable caching. this is actually a blog post I encourage you to read. I think perhaps I agree with the premise that Rails with Webpack is not for everyone. I would say though, I would have come at this approach with a better attitude. And maybe that's one thing that I can leave you all with today is perspective. Knowing that Webpacker will help you get set up. It will only help you get so far if you have a complicated project. It really would be important for you to understand this Webpack runtime concept and how your dependencies will impact the dependency graph when you pull them in. And understand that the things that Webpack values, the things it feels are important, are not the same as what Sprockets thinks is important. And that's a really key thing to understand. You might be better off doing something different than what we did, trying not to use that global scope, trying not to use those jQuery plugins, or maybe not even use jQuery at all. So the final sort of point here is you may need to let go of some of those old best practices that you thought you had with Sprockets when you come over to Webpack. So if you do try to take on this challenge, it's going to be frustrating. I will assure you, if you keep a positive attitude, you will survive. And that's all I've got for you all. I'm going to post the link, rasta.net. It's my website at /talks. You can find me on Twitter at Rasta. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to come share my experience with you all. Thank you. Time for
all right.
questions.
Are there any questions for us?
So if you were to start a new project, would just like from scratch with Rails, would you use Webpacker for that, or would you go plain vanilla? What do you think?
So the question was, if I was going to start a new project, would I go Webpack or plain vanilla? And I think, to quote Snugs, it all depends. I think by the way, I really like Webpack. I think I'm trying to give a dose of reality. I would say, if maybe this is an opinionated perspective here, if you have, or imagine you have a lot of JavaScript, may or maybe not, maybe it might not be a big framework or not. If you're going to benefit from things like asynchronous bundle loading, you don't want to pass all of your JavaScript on the page. And if you're willing to invest the time to understand Webpack, I would say, yes, absolutely, I would use Webpack. If I have a small project that only might have some JavaScript sprinkles in sort of the DHH parlance, maybe it would benefit just from a few little additions of maybe even vanilla JavaScript here and there. I would say maybe it's overkill. I don't think it's for every single project, and sort of knowing what your limits are, what your boundaries are on time and resources, and what you want to optimize for, the kind of analysis you need to do.
Oh, hang on, let me throw you the.
I was curious how you noticed that the fingerprints on both files were being updated. It's like kind of a subtle thing perhaps that one might not think to look at. Just curious what your process was for noticing that in the first place.
So the question, if I got it right, was how did I notice that that happened? I'm trying to remember. I think I might have seen a blog post that mentioned that caching was a problem. And I think I said, I guess I'll get to that some other time. But once I started deploying, so I was actually deploying these changes iteratively. If you notice the way Sprockets and Webpack are laid out, you can actually run them side by side. So I didn't switch all 300 source files over from Sprockets to Webpack at one time. So I was actually pre-compiling both sets of bundles for a short period of time while I was making the change. And I had the opportunity to think through these problems. So I was like, oh, I kind of heard caching might be an issue in Webpack. Let me check out what's happening. And then looking at the build output really is one of the main resources you have to see what's happening in your builds. That's when I took the time to understand. I didn't understand the runtime concept until I started diving into that article and realizing this is actually not a solved problem in Webpack. Sorry, did you have a follow-up?
No, that was it. I was looking for the box. One box? A box.
Okay, so what were you using to verify that everything was going smoothly in terms of testing? Were you actually testing all this JavaScript code as you were transitioning?
Who writes JavaScript tests? No. So the question was, how did I verify that everything was working? So we do have some JavaScript unit tests. So I actually had to transfer those over to Webpack as I was going. We do have a fairly lengthy build that runs JavaScript in the simulated browser, Kaffenberger. So I was crossing my fingers that most of the stuff would be caught. Not everything was. We definitely have some holes in the end-to-end testing, and certainly in our unit tests. So I relied heavily on sort of like let's figure out if we've broken something and manually test as well. And every now and then something would come up, like with a feature that had been forgotten about, where something was missing, like this chosen plugin we didn't notice until after it had been deployed. So that was not fun. So tests are good, is what I'm trying to say. Any other questions?
Did you came across sorry, another plugin or another gem that like injected a plugin, a JS plugin that did something or offended your application in some way that you just couldn't use it anymore in the new way Webpack does things?
Great question. So basically, did I come across a plugin or a library or some piece of code that I just couldn't get to work in Webpack? I don't think I did, but I did cheat a little bit. So we did have a Rails asset gem that takes your routes and from Rails and actually converts them into a JavaScript object through an Nyc.Rb tag, which works quite nicely in Sprockets and basically renders this a map of functions to paths into your JavaScript build in Sprockets. And to my knowledge, it hadn't been done in Webpack, but it turns out one of those loaders that are the preprocessors in Webpack land can run Nyc.Rb. It actually spins up a separate Ruby process alongside Webpack to make that work. So we ultimately decided not to go that route, but we could have. I think there's going to be some things that you can't convert, but you can get a long way by trying to fix plugins. We did have to eventually remove some things. So if I recall, we still use some foundation stuff, like foundation is the CSS framework mostly, but it has some jQuery plugins that you want to maybe use a dropdown for. And we did rewrite some of that code because we're like, well, do we really need foundation here? So some of it was sort of like, how much time do we want to invest in one thing or the other? But with those loaders, you can get a long way to changing some of that legacy behavior, which often just comes down to whether or not there are global variables in play. Any other questions?
I guess there's not a lot of American football happening in Uruguay. Hence we're not doing this.
I'm gonna stop. Can you wait? What was I gonna ask? Yes. So with Webpack, a couple of things. Number one, did you talk about dead code elimination at all?
I did not talk about dead code elimination. The question was, did I talk about dead code elimination?
Oh, who's ever heard of that concept before? Dead code elimination in here? Anyone? I think that would be like, just to touch on what it is. Like to me, that was one of the things that even sold me on Webpack.
Right, so here's what I know, and I hope that this has come across that I'm not a Webpack expert by any means. I just feel like I can get up and talk about it for 45 minutes. But the question about dead code elimination. So my understanding is that Webpack does not, in fact, do by itself dead code elimination, but one of the plugins that you would typically pull into production, which is part of the Webpacker family, is called the Uglify.js plugin. Uglify.js is a tool to minify JavaScript. So it's just basically a way to integrate Uglify.js library with Webpack. And that will do the dead code elimination. So basically, if there's any function calls that are not imported somehow into your build, if you try to say, like, one best example I can think of is like Lodash. The typical thing you might do in Lodash is import underscore from Lodash. Well, what Webpack will do is, like, I can't really tell which part of Lodash you want, so I'm just going to give it all to your build, right? And Lodash is a pretty big library. But if you use the more direct, and this will take more code, you'll have to write out each particular function you want, but you could say import get from Lodash or import find from Lodash. Actually, it'd be more accurate to say the path would be Lodash/get or Lodash/find. So you're importing just from the module that you want. So in that way, Webpack will know not to pull in the entire Lodash library. So there's some static analysis that it can do. I haven't played with it too much to see how well it works, and that would be an area where I need to learn more. But that's the general concept, to try to reduce the bundle size. And that really is a Webpack point of emphasis, not to ship these huge bundles of megabytes of JavaScript, but to try to split everything out into smaller and smaller and smaller bundles.
Exactly.
Not down to the individual module necessarily, but to definitely smaller pieces of JavaScript that will be quicker to download and evaluate, and particularly better for mobile experience as well.
Yeah, I thought that was really cool. I didn't know if it was part of Webpack, but if anyone wants to use Webpack, I would recommend that for sure, because, you know, I mean, who doesn't like to look at their code and say, oh crap, like 80% of that library I'm not using, and it just deleted all of that stuff that I wasn't using. And I think that that's worth the extra couple lines of code right there.
Did you also move your style sheet assets into Webpack? Because I had a project where we had like a whole bunch of SAS files, and I like threw it into Webpacker, and then it like all broke, and I was like, I don't know what this is. And then I just started running like, you know, asset pipeline and sprockets alongside with it. And I was like, I can't deal with this right now.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I skipped over that. We did not. So we are actually running Sprockets and Webpack side by side. We run Sprockets to bundle our CSS. We do pull in a handful of CSS assets into Webpack that are like particular to certain plugins, but all of our like application CSS is through Sprockets. So I am familiar with the pain points you felt. We basically said, let's focus on JavaScript right now. I think one weird thing about using CSS in Webpack is that you would have your import statements in JavaScript. You can import CSS files in JavaScript. That doesn't make any sense to me until you think about what CSS is. And it's essentially just a string. And when you bundle it in Webpack, by default, it will just be a string of JavaScript in Webpack with some additional configuration, because everything in Webpack, you have to tell it what to do. You can make it take that string that's initially a JavaScript module, and when you load the page, it will take then that JavaScript module and put it into a script tag dynamically so that it becomes CSS. With Webpack, with Webpacker, you get a configuration that says, instead of doing that, pull all the CSS out into a separate CSS file at build time. To get it to work, there's perhaps some challenges with like finding the right paths to things. That might be the issues y'all ran into. I don't have enough experience with it to be able to say this kind of survival tips I talked about with JavaScript, but I would imagine many of them could apply in that context. We're still running Sprockets to run CSS, but I think we may take on that challenge over the next few months because it's also pretty slow. That's right. In fact, that's the way it's been designed, is that you can still use Webpack to do both, to do JavaScript for some of those sprinkles or global code, and that's completely separate from your Webpack bundle, if that's what you want to do.
So you talk about immigration, which is great talk, by the way. But now that you're done, how it's like, is it affecting in any good way your day-to-day development or the team? Like, is affecting productivity or ramp up of new developers or anything like that? Like,
Yeah, so
how
great question. I don't think I did a good enough job of explaining what was the end result for our team. And I would say sort of unequivocally that our development experience has improved greatly. I don't have exact measurements, but like I mentioned before, when we use sprockets, it would take almost 15 seconds to reload the page, which it's just like it basically may as well be, you know, the whole day. Like, it's, imagine trying to do that now 5 times in a row because you forgot like a semicolon or something. Who uses semicolons? But the fact that when you make a change in Webpack, it has this auto refresh feature, the web dev server. So I could actually be making changes and saving files, and before I've even switched back over to the browser and sort of going back and forth, Webpack's already compiling ahead of time, and it will actually, if you want to configure your dev server, it inserts a little WebSocket connection where it can refresh the page for you. Other tools do this. It's not particular Webpack, but our development experience has improved. Now that we're writing ES6 modules, I feel like the entire team, which we all came in with different backgrounds and JavaScript experience, I think everyone feels like ES6 has improved the way we write JavaScript. We also integrate with ESLint, so we catch a lot of syntax errors more quickly. I think it's just harder to configure these things in sprockets. It's not typical, at least in my experience of Rails projects, to have these kind of tools set up. I think you probably can do it. I know that Sprockets 4 has been in development for several years. It's still in beta, I think maybe since 2015 or something. But you can do ES6 development with Sprockets 4. So we could have chosen to stick with Sprockets, but I think by far the speed at which we can develop is greatly improved, and I'm pretty sure most of my teammates would say the same. I don't have exact numbers, and I think it would differ for every project, but I think it's been a huge improvement for us. Besides some of these configuration challenges, which once you figure them out, you can sort of set it and forget it. But it was sort of, that was probably most of the pain was getting it set up. Any other questions? How many folks, maybe just to give me some feedback for how I can improve this talk, think about on a scale of 1 to 5, you won't hurt my feelings if it's a low 1 or a high 5. If you give me a feeling of how much you learned today on a scale of 1 to 5. Okay. Awesome, well, I appreciate that. You have a way to reach out to me either through my website or Twitter handle if you have questions, or even if you want to suggest things that you would have liked to have heard, or you can come talk to me afterwards. I would really appreciate it, and thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Ross. I think it was a great talk. The folks at RailsConf are going to appreciate this one. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. It's a pleasure to see some familiar faces, some new faces, people mingling together. I hope you can all meet more of each other. For doing a great job on the pizza. And if I may ask for one thing on as you're getting ready, just take whatever you have that belongs in garbage or recycle, put it in a garbage recycling. And the last thing, for next month or the month after, think of a talk that you would wish to give on this stage. This is a great venue to do a practice run, or to actually do something that you've done internally in your company and kind of you want to bring it to a larger audience. So a few ways to contact us. I guess the easiest one is probably through Meetup. We'll redirect you after that because we actually track all of the talks on a GitHub issues. We use GitHub for like everything for Nyc.Rb. So we can redirect you, but and contact us. You know, I hope that's clear. All right, cool. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ross.